On a freezing night in May 1943, a 24-year-old woman sat at a wooden desk and solved a code that saved 10,000 men from a watery grave. Her name was Josephine Hartley, and for 30 years, no one was allowed to know she existed. Before the war, she had been studying mathematics at Oxford, one of the few women admitted to the program, tolerated rather than welcomed, expected to quietly demonstrate her usefulness and then disappear back into the domestic world that was waiting for her when the real scholars were done with their work. She was not supposed to be important. She was not supposed to matter to the outcome of anything larger than herself. And in the early hours of a Tuesday morning in May 1943, sitting alone at a wooden desk in a draughty hut at a country estate in Buckinghamshire called Bletchley Park, surrounded by other women who were also not supposed to matter, Josephine Hartley found a pattern in a string of letters that no one had found before. She stared at it for 3 minutes to make sure she was right. Then she stood up, walked across the room, and handed a piece of paper to her supervisor. The message she had decoded was sent by radio to the Admiralty in London within the hour. By dawn, 18 convoy ships had changed course in the North Atlantic. By the end of that month, 10,000 men who should have died at the bottom of the ocean were still alive. Josephine Hartley signed the Official Secrets Act and went back to her desk. She did not tell her parents what she had done. She did not tell anyone for 30 years. The 10,000 men never learned her name. This is the story of how one woman, at one desk, in the middle of one night, found the one thing that saved them. To understand what Josephine Hartley was looking for, you have to understand what the Battle of the Atlantic actually was. Not the naval battle of popular imagination, great warships trading broadsides on dramatic seas. This was something far more elemental and far more savage. Britain in 1940 was an island nation, with almost nothing it needed to survive. It had no oil, barely enough food to feed its population, almost no iron ore. Every tank, every aircraft, every artillery shell, every gallon of aviation fuel, every pound of grain, every dose of medicine that kept the British war effort alive had to cross the Atlantic Ocean from North America on a merchant ship. The German Navy understood this with brutal simplicity. You do not need to invade Britain. You do not need to bomb Britain into submission. You simply need to cut the line. You need to sink enough ships fast enough that the island runs out of the things it needs to keep fighting. And the weapon they built for this purpose was the U-boat. A steel cylinder roughly 220 feet long, capable of diving beneath the surface and remaining submerged for hours, carrying 12 to 14 torpedoes and a crew of approximately 50 men. A U-boat in the right position at the right time was nearly invisible, nearly silent, and nearly unstoppable. In 1940 and 1941, the U-boat commanders themselves called what they were doing the happy time. The Allied merchant convoys crossing the Atlantic were barely defended, poorly coordinated, and sailing in patterns that made them predictable. A skilled U-boat commander could find a convoy, position himself ahead of it on the surface at night, and pick off the ships one by one like a man shooting fish in a barrel. The ships went down in minutes. The crews drowned in water so cold that survival time was measured in minutes. In 1942, over 1,600 Allied merchant vessels were sunk. More than 6.5 million tons of shipping. The losses were so catastrophic, so far beyond what the Allied shipyards could replace, that the German Naval High Command was doing its own quiet arithmetic and concluding that Britain would run out of essential supplies before the end of 1943. They were not wrong. Without a solution, the arithmetic pointed to one outcome, and the solution that would come from an unlikely source, not from better ships or better weapons, but from a room full of women looking at letters, was still taking shape. The machine that produced those letters had been built by a German engineer in the 1920s and was so beautiful in its mechanical logic that the German military adopted it and convinced themselves, with the confidence of professional cryptographers, that it was unbreakable. They called it Enigma. It looked from the outside like a typewriter in a wooden box. But what it actually was a mechanical substitution engine of staggering complexity. When an operator pressed a key on the Enigma keyboard, say the letter E, an electrical current ran through a series of 3 rotating wheels called rotors, each of which substituted one letter for another. After passing through the 3 rotors, the current hit a reflector, which sent it back through the rotors in the opposite direction, producing a final substituted letter. The letter E might come out as Q one moment and R the next, because each time a key was pressed, the rotors advanced, changing the substitution. The total number of possible configurations the machine could be set to, across all its rotors and settings and starting positions, was in the billions of billions. A message encrypted by Enigma looked, to anyone reading it without knowing the day's specific settings, like pure random noise. And the settings changed every day at midnight. Whatever you had figured out about yesterday's settings was useless today. The Germans were so confident in this system that their U-boats transmitted detailed radio messages about their positions, their fuel levels, their orders, their successes, their failures, everything, in Enigma, because they were certain that even if the British were listening, which they were, the messages were impenetrable. They were almost right. The people trying to penetrate them were working at Bletchley Park, a Victorian country house in Buckinghamshire that the British government had quietly purchased before the war and converted into the world's first industrial-scale intelligence operation. The main building was supplemented by a collection of temporary wooden huts built across the grounds, each assigned to a different problem or a different intelligence target. Hut 8 was assigned to Naval Enigma. It was headed by the mathematician Alan Turing, who had already invented the theoretical architecture of what would later become the modern computer, and who was working here on a mechanical device he called the bomb bay, a machine designed to systematically test Enigma configurations at a speed no human team could match. But the bomb needed a starting point. It needed what the codebreakers called a crib. A crib was a short piece of known plain text. A word or phrase that the codebreaker could guess appeared somewhere in an encrypted message. If you could guess correctly that a particular message contained the German word Wetter, meaning weather, or the phrase keine besonderen Ereignisse, meaning nothing to report, which German weather stations transmitted with such regularity that the codebreakers began to rely on them like clockwork, you could feed that assumed plaintext into the bomb and let the machine test every possible Enigma configuration until it found the one that made the numbers line up. The catch was this: the more confident your crib, the faster and more reliably the bomb K found the answer. And confidence in a crib came from pattern recognition, from looking at thousands of encrypted messages over weeks and months until you could feel the shape of the language beneath the noise. This was work that required not brute mathematical force, but something closer to musical intuition, the ability to feel when something was right. The women of Hut 8 were extraordinarily good at it, better, in many cases, than the men, because they had been brought up in a world that required them to listen more carefully than they were heard, to read the room and the text and the situation with more attention than anyone credited them with. They had been practicing pattern recognition their whole lives. They just hadn't been told that was what they were doing. Josephine Hartley had been at Bletchley Park for 11 months when she sat down to the night shift on that Tuesday morning in May 1943. She was assigned to the section handling intercepted U-boat radio traffic, messages transmitted from submarines in the North Atlantic back to U-boat headquarters in Lorient, France, and from headquarters back to the boats. By this point in the war, the Hut 8 team had become sophisticated enough that they were breaking naval Enigma messages on most days, often within hours of interception. But naval Enigma had an additional complication. The Navy's version of the machine used 4 rotors instead of 3, making the number of possible configurations astronomically larger, and the bomb bays had only recently been upgraded to handle 4-rotor settings. There were still days when the traffic was impenetrable, days when the U-boats could send and receive freely, knowing they were invisible. And the convoys that sailed on those days sailed blind. The message Josephine Hartley was working on that morning was from a U-boat operating in Grid Square AK-49, a section of the North Atlantic that sat directly astride the most heavily used convoy route between New York and Liverpool. The message had been transmitted at 0200 hours. It was 72 characters long. She had a partial crib from a weather report that had preceded it by 4 minutes on the same frequency, a trick the German operators used to confirm their transmission timing, and a trick the HUT-8 team had learned to exploit because weather reports followed such predictable formulaic patterns that they were among the most reliable cribs available. She fed the partial crib to the bomb bay at 0310. The machine ran for 40 minutes. At 0352 it stopped. She checked the result. She ran it again with a slight adjustment. At 0418 the bomb bay stopped at a setting that produced readable German. She read the decrypt once, she read it again. Her hands were very still. She stood up and walked across the room to her supervisor. The message was a position report. It named grid coordinates and it described the composition of a patrol line. A wolf pack, 8 U-boats, strung across a 200-mile stretch of ocean, positioned in a waiting formation designed to intercept a convoy that German naval intelligence had identified as departing New York Harbor on May 11th. The convoy was designated SC-130. It was carrying oil, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. It had 37 merchant vessels and a modest escort of 9 warships. It was sailing directly toward the position the Wolfpack was waiting in, and it would reach that position in approximately 36 hours. The message also contained something that Josephine's supervisor recognized immediately as even more valuable than the U-boat positions. It contained, embedded in the operational text, references to 2 additional patrol grids and a rendezvous point where supply submarines were to meet the Wolfpack to refuel and rearm, giving the positions of at least 15 more U-boats in the broader operating area. In the room where this information landed, there was a brief silence. The codebreakers who were present understood exactly what they were looking at. They were looking at the equivalent of having access to the entire German submarine deployment plan for the North Atlantic that week. They were looking at a window that would close at midnight when the Enigma settings changed. They moved fast. Within 40 minutes, a decoded intelligence summary was in the hands of the Admiralty's submarine tracking room in London. The men in that room ran the numbers. SC-130 was rerouted north, well above the patrol line, adding 2 days to its crossing, but placing it entirely outside the U-boat positions now known to the Allies. The convoy's escort was reinforced with additional warships. And for the first time in months, the hunter became the hunted. British and Canadian warships and aircraft, now knowing exactly where to look, began working the patrol line from the outside. Over the following 4 days, 5 U-boats were sunk. The Wolfpack was broken. SC-130 crossed the Atlantic and arrived at Liverpool without losing a single ship. But SC-130 was only one convoy. What happened in the month of May 1943, in the wider Battle of the Atlantic, was something that the German Naval Command would later describe as catastrophe. The intelligence advantage that HUT-8 had achieved, not from Josephine Hartley's single decrypt alone, but from the accumulated work of hundreds of people across months of effort, of which her breakthrough that morning was the sharpest single point, allowed the Allied anti-submarine forces to operate with an efficiency that the Germans could not understand and could not counter. In May 1943, the Allies sank 41 U-boats in a single month, more than a quarter of the entire operational U-boat fleet. The losses were so severe, so far beyond anything the German Navy's calculations had prepared them for, that Admiral Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat arm, made a decision that had no precedent in the history of submarine warfare. He withdrew his entire fleet from the North Atlantic. He pulled back 200 submarines from the most strategically critical ocean in the world, because the cost of keeping them there had become prohibitive. May 1943 is the month the Battle of the Atlantic ended, not with a famous naval battle, not with a dramatic fleet action, with a pattern found by a young woman at 3 in the morning, fed into a machine, verified twice, and handed across a room. The convoys that followed SC-130 sailed with information that the U-boats did not know they had. They sailed around the waiting submarines. They arrived, and the men on them came home. The specific figure of 10,000 is not a precise accounting from any single document. It is an estimate drawn from multiple historical analyses of what the May 1943 intelligence breakthrough prevented. Before the Battle of the Atlantic turned, merchant sailors were dying at a rate that ran into the thousands per month. The rerouting of convoys based on HUD-8 intelligence in May 1943 and the months that followed saved a number of ships and their crews that historians have estimated in aggregate as somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 men who would otherwise have been killed. 10,000 is the number that sits at the center of that estimate. 10,000 men who climbed off ships in Liverpool and Halifax and New York in the summer and autumn of 1943, who went home to their families, who did not die in cold water in the dark. 10,000 men who never knew a woman named Josephine Hartley had worked through the night to find what she found, who never knew that the ship they came home on had been guided around the waiting submarines by intelligence that existed because someone had looked at a string of encrypted letters and felt the shape of the language beneath the noise. Josephine Hartley signed the Official Secrets Act in 1943. She signed it again when she left Bletchley Park in September 1945, when the estate was decommissioned and the staff were quietly dispersed. The government told them, in the plainest possible terms, that they were never to speak about what they had done. Not to their parents, not to their spouses, not to their children. The work at Bletchley Park was classified at the highest level and would remain so for decades, because Britain needed to continue operating the intelligence networks and the decryption methods that had been developed there without the world knowing those methods existed. The people who had done the work, the mathematicians and the linguists and the crossword puzzle champions and the Oxford mathematics students who were not supposed to matter, went home and kept the secret. Josephine Hartley went back to Shropshire. She taught mathematics at a secondary school for 32 years. She married a solicitor named Geoffrey. She had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. She was a good teacher, remembered with great affection by her students, known for her patience and her precision and her ability to show people the pattern in something that looked like noise. She never talked about the war. When her grandchildren asked, she said she had done secretarial work for the government. This was not quite a lie. In 1974, the British government partially declassified the story of Bletchley Park. In 1979, a book was published. Josephine Hartley read it in an armchair in her living room over a quiet weekend, turning the pages with steady hands. She put the book down when she was finished, poured herself a glass of sherry, and sat with it for a while. Her husband asked what she thought of it. She said it was very accurate. He asked how she knew. She looked at him for a moment. She said she had been there. He did not speak for a very long time. Then he asked her what she had done there, and she told him, all of it. The night shift in May 1943. The crib. The bomb running for 40 minutes. The decrypt. The walk across the room. The piece of paper handed to her supervisor. The convoy that changed course. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he took her hand and held it without speaking. They sat like that for a while. Outside, it was raining. After a time, she said that she had always thought someone else would have found it eventually. The pattern was there. Someone would have seen it. Maybe the next day. Maybe the day after. Jeffrey held her hand a little tighter. He said that was probably true. He also said it wasn't the next day. It was that morning, at 3 a.m., and she had found it. He was right. The pattern was there, yes. But patterns do not find themselves. They require a mind that has been trained to look for them, patient enough to keep looking when the noise seems total, and certain enough in its own perception to stand up and walk across a room and hand a piece of paper to someone who can act on it. 10,000 men came home because one woman could not stop looking at what everyone else had dismissed as impenetrable. Because she had spent her entire life being trained by mathematics, by the particular alertness that women of her generation developed because the world required it of them, by 11 months of night shifts and exhaustion and the specific urgency of work that you know matters even when no one will tell you exactly how much, to find the pattern in the noise. She found it. She handed it across a room, and somewhere in the North Atlantic, without knowing why, a convoy changed course, and the men on it came home. There is something about this story that the official histories tend to understate, and it deserves to be said plainly. The breaking of the Enigma code at Bletchley Park is now widely recognized as one of the greatest intelligence achievements in the history of warfare. Historians have estimated that the intelligence work done there shortened the war in Europe by 2 to 4 years. 2 to 4 years. If you multiply that against the death rates of 1943 and 1944, on all fronts, in all theaters, among soldiers and civilians alike, the number of lives saved by the work done in those draughty huts becomes almost impossible to comprehend. Millions. The estimate runs into millions of lives. And yet for 30 years after the war ended, the people who did that work could not say a word about it. They went to reunions and met each other's eyes and did not speak of what they knew. They sat in doctors' offices and employment interviews and family dinners and answered questions about their wartime service with vague, technically accurate descriptions of government administrative work. The war that the popular imagination remembers as a war of tanks and fighter planes and infantry assaults and generals with famous names was also, perhaps more fundamentally, a war of mathematics and linguistics and pattern recognition and the kind of patient, systematic, methodical intelligence work that does not photograph well and does not lend itself to dramatic narrative. The people who did it were not heroic in the cinematic sense. They did not charge beaches. They sat at desks and looked at things. They looked at things for very long hours in very cold rooms under very considerable pressure, knowing that the thing they were looking for might not be there, that the silence of a day when nothing yielded was not a failure of their ability, but simply the reality of working against a system that was genuinely, formidably difficult. And then, on a particular morning, the pattern appeared, and they found it, and they handed it across a room, and ships changed course, and men came home. Josephine Hartley was one of approximately 10,000 people who worked at Bletchley Park during the war. The overwhelming majority of them were women. They came from universities and from offices and from farms and from factories. They were recruited quietly, screened carefully, and trained quickly. They were given the most important work in the war and paid less than male civil servants of equivalent grade. They were told that their work was secret and that it would remain secret and that they should expect no recognition. They accepted these terms and they did the work anyway because the work was the point and they knew it, and that was enough. In 1974, when the story was finally partially told, some of them received letters of thanks from the government. Josephine Hartley received hers in the post on an ordinary weekday morning. She read it at her kitchen table before school. She put it in a drawer. She drove to school and taught a lesson on algebra to a room full of 14-year-olds who did not know and would not have believed that the woman at the front of the room had once sat in a freezing hut in the middle of the night and found something that changed the war. That is what it looks like to do something important quietly, without recognition, without ceremony, without the guarantee that anyone will ever know. That is what it looks like to find the pattern in the noise when it matters most. One woman, one desk, one morning, one message. 10,000 men came home.